We all figured something like this could happen, but we never, ever would have thought it would turn out this way. I mean, most of us either had the most basic of information intertwined with, holy God, mountains of disinformation to keep us confused, or we had no idea of the truth of what the hell was going on anyway. We would all get the truth as the fight began outside our own atmosphere. A fight that was confusing as it was brutal. By the time the general population knew what in the holy shit was going on, the so called leaders had already scurried away to their luxury bunkers to wait out the carnage, leaving the rest of us that had no idea what the hell was going on to deal with everything that was about to turn our wonderful blue and green ball into an enormous killing field. We only realized the scope of this as Earth itself became its own battle station, as the vast majority of us had no idea what the hell was happening. The old missiles began to burst out of their silos. This was enough to make everybody suddenly go, oh, we're dead, as everyone considered that there was a nuclear war, which would mean that the entire nation had about 30 minutes before we were draped in nuclear winter for the next 30 years. But what came out was, I don't know, better or worse, depends on how you look at it. The military was going absolutely nuts as they hastily prepared all their weapons as aircraft began to climb high into the sky. That wasn't the weird part, though. The weird part was, along with all this, strange aircraft, vessels, we weren't sure what the hell they were, started rising from under multiple hidden facilities across the planet, from Alaska to Nevada to West Virginia, just in that one continent. A few dozen of these strange machines shot up, letting everybody know that yes, these things were hidden around the world. We just didn't know where they were. Yet around the world, the same display was being seen as these ships would seemingly burst out of the ground and go completely vertical, like some sort of F-15 pilot who wanted to become an astronaut. Who, or what I should say, was entering our atmosphere in ships that had to be 10 to 15 kilometers long. They were so long that you could see them in the sky if you squinted, but you wouldn't have to squint for very long, as they were slowly coming down, and there wasn't anything that was going to stop them. What surprised everyone is the ships seemed to be non aggressive. They weren't shooting anybody, they weren't deploying anything. That is, until the first ones were hit. That's when the battle truly started. The battle would be known as the day the sky burned. This was very accurate, as nuclear weapons began striking all over the sky. They would explode on either side of the thermosphere or magnetosphere, also known as the Kármán line. The force of these weapons was decided specifically on how deep into the mesosphere the ship actually was when it was struck, as each nuclear weapon actually required atmosphere to work exactly the way we expect it to. Though outside the force, the heat melted the hull, and if they were high enough, then immediately started to cool, which causes all sorts of thermal cracks to happen. The force itself from the explosion could also break one of these ships in half if hit in the right spot, which wasn't too hard considering the size of these ships. Although, usually, the only thing that happened was large pieces were broke off. Yet the most devastating part was the EMP. Well, that did cause problems all around the world. The multiple EMP shockwaves crippled every electrical grid on the planet. Any radiation was barely an afterthought as the world went dark. Those of us on the ground could only watch as these ships or vessels, whatever the hell you want to call it, from space continued with their landing. Several broke up and came down, burning like that giant ship from the science fantasy video game as it slowly descended as it burned from all different sides. When we finally saw the two odd type ships fire on each other, we didn't know who in the hell we were supposed to root for. We'd never even seen these before, but we could tell that they fired on each other with unseen prejudice. The two different types of vessels tore into each other and getting holes blown clean through them. Others began to burn as they came through the atmosphere, just blowing up from internal components blasting to pieces. A few just seemed to pause before exploding in massive fireballs that would light up the sky, and for a moment, if you were on the dark side of the planet, it was daytime in the middle of the night. It looked as though both sides are very evenly matched. That was until our equipment joined the fight. Ground based missiles began to crash into everything that didn't look, well, that didn't even seem to be made by humans. Aircraft got within range and emptied all their payloads before banking away, not just to rearm as they still had their guns, more like getting the hell out of the way as the next wave of munitions came in. The strange craft that were going up deployed drones almost the same time the craft descending did, releasing their swarms. Those of us that stood up there watching just were amazed and also in abject terror, as it seemed like both sides were simply massive hives and someone had just pissed on a hornet's nest. As the two groups began to intermix, the fire became so intense, every vessel, drone, or whatever was being crippled. This didn't seem to stop the descent. If anything, it enhanced it, as many of the ships seemed to lose their ability to slowly descend and they headed straight towards the ground. Some of those that went up suddenly reversed course, but not willingly, and headed down. On the ground, cannons and short range missiles began being raised. The moment they got the word, "No friendlies in the airspace," they let loose with everything they had. Every missile and rocket pod was immediately emptied. Cannons fired nearly vertical, lowered enough to reload, and then raise again, like their barrels were being used to conduct an orchestra, as each of these artillery regiments would fire everything into whatever ship they could hit. If it wasn't human, it was coming apart. And soon both sides were in tatters. And with both sides torn a new bunghole, all ships began their landing processes. This was obvious as massive landing struts began to extend from every single one of them that wasn't already screaming down towards the surface. This doesn't slow them down from blasting each other on their way down. The lack of usable weapons does, though, as most of them had been either emptied, damaged, or simply blown clean off. When they finally made planetfall, that is when things got very, very interesting. It seemed around the world, militaries continued to gear up. Most of their ammo holding areas, or AHAs, were completely EMP resistant and were also immediately emptied. All military watercraft are natural Faraday cages, so the EMPs didn't really matter. Along with that, even if one system did go down, there were so many redundant systems that it didn't seem to matter. But the big issue was neither side had fired on the planet. Neither side had targeted human forces. Almost every single unit across the entire planet was still intact. This was not even counting the second largest military on the planet, the militia. Now that these strange vessels are on the surface, it's time to get this party started with a bang. Once the giant vessels were on the ground, they immediately got swarmed by any humans. In some areas, it seemed as though the locals just wanted to strip the ship for parts as they ran up without weapons and just started tearing pieces off and running away. Others came out with sheer curiosity and just stared, conversed with each other, and looked, not knowing what they were seeing. Everyone else showed up with weapons, and they were not happy. As the ships opened, everyone got a shock. There were two distinct types of extraterrestrials out there, and none of them were the nice ones you saw in a 1980s movie. One, a bunch of small, gray, big-eyed humanoids, all wearing a strange black bodysuit carrying something. Nobody knew if it was a weapon at first, but they would find out really quick. The others were a humanoid reptile standing much taller than the average human, and also carrying their own type of items, shall we say. Though they didn't wear much clothing, they were still very imposing. The humans on the ground were not taking any chances. And it was a good thing, too. Both sides seemed to start the shooting immediately. Near every ship still relatively intact. Massive firefights never seemed to stop. Civilians had enough firepower to at least slow down the enemy forces. In countries where weapons are prevalent, they were faring far better. So much so that a few people were starting to use the enemy's weapons as they were able to actually rip them off the bodies. In countries where weapons are sparse, they found themselves, well, for lack of a better term, overrun. Eventually, in some places where they didn't have weapons strong enough to actually pierce the hide of the reptilians or reach past the long range of the Greys, they had to run for the hills and run for their lives. Then the militaries arrived. They began their systematic movement across the planet from their home countries and began bringing holy hell. Those without a cohesive military were able to fight, but they could not hold any ground taken, and would immediately have a constant ebb and flow, as they would be able to rush in, take ground, but they just couldn't hold it. This also happened where the amount of military was just not enough. A strong military was able to bolster the forces on the ground and through the air. Civilian aircraft were immediately loaded up and done strafing runs. On the ground, civilian and military fought side by side. They all rained hellfire on their targets in between drops of artillery. Any calls for command to not fire on certain alien forces were quickly ignored. This was due to the fact that no one actually knew if this was a fake or what. All they knew is there was some alien assholes that need to be killed. In forested areas, the alien forces found themselves lost in the trees, the hills, and questionable terrain. If they crashed above the Arctic Circle or below the Antarctic Circle, they found the weather to be, well, for lack of a better term, deadly within a matter of minutes. If they found themselves in rainforests, they found themselves dealing also in outbacks, would be poisonous animals, venomous insects and reptiles, dangerous megafauna, unpredictable weather. All these factors compiled into one large killing field around each of the ships that had somehow been able to land. Those that had crashed usually didn't have many that were able to fight, let alone if they even survived. Then, of course, they had to deal with the dominant species of this planet that would just not stop. They used heat beams against them, which only seemed to piss them off. Particle beams worked, but not for long. The human would instantly target the firing beam and destroy it if it was attached to any type of vehicle or vessel. As the civilians and military continued to pummel the positions, several of the ships attempted to lift off. Although once they were seen powering up any type of engine, all arms began to be focused towards that ship in particular. And that would be taken down hard, focused mainly on wherever they thought the engines were. If not, they would aim for the bridge. If they didn't have that, well, when in doubt, empty the magazine. Inside facilities all over the planet, another battle raged. The gray drones tried to force the humans to override on military control and make sure that humans did not target them and instead targeted their mortal enemy. It wasn't too long before each facility was shaking with explosives, so much so that in several areas you could see the smoke coming out of each of the hatches and where they had their exhaust. The humans inside finally said fuck it as they were done with everything and took back the facilities room by room. Though the drones were strong and quick, well, strong by their standard, but not by human, but they were very quick and they did have advanced weapons. It didn't matter as they were eventually overrun. Within a single week of all this fighting, all this chaos, 60% of the planet's surface, the dry surface itself, was secured. Not a single ship that had landed in the ocean was ever able to take off again, as too many holes had been blown in it and they simply sunk all the way to the bottom. It was noted that on several sonar arrays they could hear the hull squeezing, slowly squeezing, and then kadump as the entire thing crushed in on itself. These ships were designed for space, not oceans. Within 3 weeks, the fighting was almost over. The remaining forces on both sides of the invading forces were now just trying to survive away from their vessels. Reason being is once they had become static targets, the human weapons designed specifically to penetrate disabled or destroyed their ships outright with one, maybe two strikes, and yet they didn't stop. And this would eventually leave those who stayed in the ship, well, it wasn't a ship anymore, it was a tomb. The Greys, with their tech, could not compensate for their frail bodies. A single 308 slug tore their bodies apart. What happened when they were hit with a shotgun was considered just, well, gross. Though their strange energy bolt style weapons were devastating to the human body, the fact that they are very inable, as in they didn't have any agility. Their species is, well, the way they're designed, they simply have to stay upright and walk. They don't move that fast either. And what really put it back is the fact that they're almost bright white, so much so that they can be seen in the dark without night vision. And this makes them very easy targets. The reptilians, as they would know as the Silurians, did slightly better initially. Their belief that humans would simply run in fear just from the sight of them, as they always had before, caused many of them to greatly overestimate their ability. Not to say they're not imposing, as most of them have a very humanoid appearance, yet they're very large, and this was enough to make many of the locals run as they had no idea what in the hell they were looking at. And of course, ignorance is where fear comes from. At least in a few places on this planet, they ran. Others didn't even fall back at the sight of these things. Due to their large size, small caliber ammo didn't seem to do anything except piss them off. Then again, a 5.56 may only be a bee sting to them. But remember that one sting hurts, and 1,000 stings will kill you. Anywhere on the planet that had high caliber weapons, and of course the hypervelocity bullets to go with them, well, let's just say the reptiles didn't exactly get very far. The main advantage, at least technology speaking, that the reptilians seemed to have was their main weapon, which was a distance weapon. As everyone would find out, that is a portable particle projection cannon, so small that it's not much bigger than a 500 Win Mag. It's actually quite light. Very, very, very effective. Seriously, you don't want to be hit with this thing. Hits you in the shoulder, it will literally blow your shoulder apart. And also burn the wound shut. So you're sitting there screaming on the ground for a medic as they're like, well, there's nothing we can do. Just kind of take the pain. Here's some morphine. The only problem with this weapon is its firing rate is complete and total shit. One shot every 15 to 30 seconds. That's nothing. That's plenty of time to get all sorts of projectiles thrown at you, and suddenly, while you're trying to reload, you have your new life as a spaghetti strainer. With the battles ending all over the world, rule makers decree that all alien tech be turned into the proper authorities, i.e., them, and no one else is allowed to have them. This, of course, is quickly ignored by pretty much everyone. Now the world is slowly getting back to its new version of, shall we say, normal, normality, or however you want to put that. Those that tried to exert control over the population quickly found that the general population just didn't trust them anymore and would not follow their orders. Though the general population would still pull together in their own countries, nations, borders, whatever you want to call it, so they had some sense of normality and that commerce could actually flow. Every time these same personnel would come up and demand that all those obey them. turn in all the alien tech and go back to living in willful ignorance? Well, they were always greeted with one of three answers, the same type of answers that were given to the Xenos, and throughout history, these same answers have carried the same weight. Every time they tried to take these, they would hear either, "Come and take them," "Don't tread on me," or the same thing they had just told not only the invaders, but those that had been hiding underneath the surface for a long time: "Get off my lawn."